She was a born leader, a most unbearable snob, and a self-appointed gatekeeper. They called her Mrs. Astor. The Mrs. Astor. And she would banish you out of her existence, if you were deemed unfit for New York society. Welcome to Schmancy, the place where we talk all things rich, exclusive, and fancy schmancy. Oh how sweet it is, to brazenly declare who is and who isn't worthy of your presence. Well, before exclusive country clubs and private VIP clubs became all the rage, there was Mrs. Astor. And she was a force to be reckoned with. As one of the most notorious gatekeepers in New York history, have you ever asked yourself just how she saw the world? What is it that made this famous doyenne of the Gilded Age the way she was? Well, today, we are zooming in to do just that. And so without further ado, let's get into the mind of Mrs. Astor. Born on September 22, 1830, as Caroline Webster Schermerhorn, she was known as Lena throughout her youth. When it came to her pedigree, Lena was the real deal. She came from a wealthy family, who were part of New York's knickerbockeracy. This was a collection of old merchant and landowning families, who could trace their lineage back to the days of Dutch colonial New York. Back when the city was known as New Amsterdam. Her father was of the prominent Schermerhorns, while her mother was of Van Cortlandt. If you take a quick tour around New York City, it won't be long before you encounter buildings, parks, streets, and subway stations named after these two families. In other words, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was bona fide New York City aristocracy. Educated by some of the finest tutors from France, she was well-traveled, spoke several languages, and always lived a very posh life. In 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr. He was the grandson of the original John Jacob Astor, and a descendant of both the Armstrong and Livingston families. Next to her husband, Lena had the superior pedigree, as she was an old Knickerbocker, with Dutch ancestors in New York since the 1600s. His family of German and Scottish descent went back only a couple generations. Nevertheless, he was no Joe Schmo. Third generation or not, he came with a lot of money, way more than her own family. And she came with a pedigree that could easily shoot him to the upper echelons of the social hierarchy. Was it the greatest love of all? Definitely not. Simply economic and political moves, which suited them both just fine. Together, they had 5 children. And as was standard for her time, Lena spent the early decades of her marriage settling into her role as a perfect upper-class wife and mother. She was rich, well-educated, owned several fashionable homes throughout the Northeast, and had a slew of servants at her beck and call. What more could a woman of her stature ask for? As a woman who appeared to have everything, Lena was a woman of purpose. However, in the male-dominated society of her times, she wasn't allowed to have a career. She was satiated for a short period raising her children, and managing a household of servants. Nevertheless, as the children grew into adulthood, she began to feel as if she was destined for much bigger and better things. It was the 1800s, and as a relatively new nation, certain members of the New York elite desired a class system similar to what the Europeans had. They wanted an American aristocracy. And so similar to the courts of Europe, they built luxurious mini-palaces, draped themselves in dazzling jewels, sported fancy schmancy outfits, stuck to rigid codes of etiquette, obsessed over their lineage, partied with actual members of the European nobility, and sometimes even shipped their daughters off to Europe to marry a marquis, or an earl. Though there were no titles in the United States, Lena set her sights on becoming the first queen of New York society. Unlike the typical upper-class housewife, she had no interest in settling for a mediocre life. Her husband was a well-known philanderer and barely at home. He was the outdoors type, who spent much of his time at their country home or on his yacht. The truth is, he himself couldn't stand to be around her. But instead of crying her eyes out over him or his affairs, Lena threw herself into what she thought was her life's purpose, which was playing hardball on the social scene. A born leader in a male-dominated society, she was never one to be at the mercy of her husband. She came into the marriage already with her own money. And so she pretty much did her own thing, as she happily spent his money. If you were to meet Lena today, you'd most likely find her running the show as a ruthless CEO, or perhaps even running for mayor as a well-connected politician. Sadly, due to the strict gender roles of the late 1800s, being the queen of New York society was the most a woman of her stature could aspire to. Nevertheless, as a strong-willed, power-hungry woman, she made it her life's mission to rise to the top and bring law and order to the New York aristocracy. The decades following the American Civil War brought in a slew of nouveau riche families eager for admittance into New York high society. many of whom had accumulated way more wealth than the old establishment. Of course, Lena was one of many who were not impressed by their newfound wealth. She felt many of these newcomers lacked the class and etiquette to make it into the aristocracy, and was quite simply disgusted by their ostentatious ways. Change had arrived, in an even more affluent package, and it began to threaten the dominance of the old New York establishment. In times like these, there was no room for compromise. The standards of the old guard had to be kept at all costs. And Lena decided she would be the one who called the shots for what everyone considered proper society. She enlisted the help of Ward McAllister, a well-known socialite snob of the Southern gentry, and together they defined the boundaries of an extremely rigid and homogeneous society. One where only 400 people could be counted as members of New York society. And one that made it easy to ban the multitudes, as it came with a set of strict requirements, elaborate rules, and hard-to-remember standards of etiquette. There was absolutely no way Lena was going to allow these uncouth newcomers to come in and take over a society her ancestors had worked so hard to establish. Moving forward, it would have to be her way, or the highway. For some jealous reason, Caroline found the new money but insanely wealthy Vanderbilts particularly repulsive. To her, the Vanderbilts were not just members of the nouveau riche class. To her, they were subordinates from that inferior railroad money. She had always detested those from railroad money. And so, she made sure to exclude the entire family from all her fancy events. Her elaborate, highly publicized, and highly sought-after parties were a staple of Gilded Age New York. And as the Vanderbilts grew more rich and more powerful, their exclusion from her parties was seen as obviously intentional and a massive snub. However, by 1883, she could no longer ignore them, as she had finally met her match in Alva Vanderbilt, one of the high-profile wives of the Vanderbilt family. As a bold, clever, and equally ambitious woman with a purpose, Alva was able to finagle a specific situation to her advantage, and in turn, had Caroline practically begging to add Alva to her list of 400. Ultimately, Caroline was never able to rule New York society to the fullest extent of her law. For a good part of her reign, she had the much wealthier Alva Vanderbilt to contend with, as Alva always had a backup plan in store, for when Caroline made things too difficult. Now, to be seriously regarded as the Queen of New York society, Caroline knew she eventually had to make it official with a title. And so, following the death of John Astor III, she insisted on being recognized as the matriarch of the Astor family, and being addressed simply as Mrs. Astor. It was an unauthorized move, as such a title was meant for the wife of her nephew William Waldorf. But she didn't care. In her mind, the title was up for grabs. And after years of dedicating herself to the grueling job of snubbery in the ballrooms of high society, she believed she had earned it. She was determined to become the Mrs. Astor, and wasn't the least bothered by her nephew's anger, or the rift it caused in the Astor family. Her stubbornness on the matter was the final straw for William Waldorf. Shortly after losing his side of the battle, he moved his entire family to England, never to return again. As for the newly crowned Mrs. Astor, she reveled in her glory, and continued to remain steadfast to her list of 400, as more and more of these pesky newcomers continued to invade her beloved New York. If there was one thing Mrs. Astor valued the most, next to power, it was society's perception of her. There was no way she would have been able to dominate high society, had she not garnered the respect she received from others. She understood the illusion of power, and knew quite well that if society ever witnessed her soft side, if they knew private things about her, if they pitied her, if they saw her as a laughingstock, or worse if they saw her at a weak moment, the illusion she'd created around her would all come crashing down. She knew her power of intimidation lied in remaining stoic, elusive, and discreet. Therefore, she was sure to keep a serene and even composure at all times. In spite of her sham marriage, and all the other scandals that took place in her family, she never let up, and never confided in anyone about her personal problems. There were no close friendships, no sharing of her private life or feelings, with anyone. She would simply pretend the drama didn't exist in her personal life. At some point, everyone knew her marriage was not up for discussion, regardless of how messy it was. Neither was her daughter's scandalous affair and divorce, nor her feud with William Waldorf. If you tested her with prying questions, she would politely dissuade you from ever asking again. Basically, she was not going to set herself up as fodder for society gossip. Mrs. Astor was a woman who realized early on that protecting her privacy and maintaining her dignity would be the keys to her success. And with that, she became a master of discretion and deflection. Though Mrs. Astor, and the likes of her, may have had a strong aversion to all the new money flowing into New York society. There really was nothing anyone could do to stop it from happening. The old money pond had become stagnant and stale. Of course, we all know what happens to standing water. Mrs. Astor's snobbish attempts with Ward McAllister to keep the old separated from the new were only a temporary solution. She had built a dam in an attempt to keep fresh water from flowing into the old pond. And not once did she realize that her dam had numerous cracks and was leaking all throughout. Though it may have worked for a time, the day would come when the dam would burst, and all the water would seek to once again flow and level itself out. The reality is, as New York society's most pretentious gatekeeper, she wasn't really keeping the gate. She was only buying time. If she only knew that change was inevitable, then perhaps she wouldn't have gone to such great lengths. If she only knew that resistance was futile, then perhaps she would have taken the time to get to know some of her new neighbors, and realize they were people just like her. She was sad to see the old New York, as she knew it, come to an end. And though she fought a good fight to keep her beloved world intact, in the end, the world simply went on without her. Mrs. Astor is buried in Trinity Church Cemetery, at 770 Riverside Drive, in Uptown Manhattan. If you happen to be in the neighborhood, feel free to pass by her grave, and let her know, Schmancy sent you. So what other tidbits about Mrs. Astor can we expand on? Was she justified for being the snob that she was? Or did she take her gatekeeping tendencies a little too far? Would you agree with her that old money is superior to new money? Or is it all smoke and mirrors? Anyway, if there's anything else you would like to mention about Mrs. Astor, or any of the other players in her circle, feel free to share it with us in the comments below. Furthermore, if you got any value out of this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and click on the bell icon, so you never miss out on another video. With that said, we'd like to thank you for watching, and we'll see each other next time.